He established the Department of Energy in 1977 to address the energy crisis and promote energy conservation and alternative energy sources. He promoted the use of fuel-efficient vehicles, leading to the implementation of corporate average fuel economy (CAFE) standards, which increased fuel efficiency in cars from an average of about 13.5 miles per gallon in 1975 to 27.5 miles per gallon in 1985. He made human rights a central tenet of U.S. foreign policy, advocating for the rights of individuals worldwide and establishing the Bureau of Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. Brokered a historic peace agreement between Israel and Egypt in 1978, which led to the signing of the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty in 1979. He expanded the Health Maintenance Organization Act to increase access to health care, signed the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act in 1980, which protected over 100 million acres of land in Alaska, implemented an economic doctrine that stated that the United States would use military force to defend its national interests in the Persian Gulf, which highlighted the importance of energy security, and he oversaw the deregulation of the airline industry, which led to increased competition and lower fares for consumers. And today, he's become the first former American president to reach the age of 100. Here with me to discuss the legacy and the accomplishments of President Jimmy Carter is Jonathan Alter, a renowned journalist, New York Times columnist, and best-selling author of his very best, Jimmy Carter: A Life. Jonathan Alter's work peels back the layers of Carter's life and presidency, showing us a man who never gave up fighting for his ideals, even when it cost him politically. And joining us a little bit later will be Les Francis, who served as Deputy Chief of Staff in the Carter White House. Les Francis has been in the room where history has happened, helping steer a presidency that balanced hope with hardship. Together, these two will help us navigate Carter's enduring impact on America's political landscape as we celebrate his 100th birthday. Mr. Alter, thank you for being back on the political mic.
It's great to be here, Mike. It's a great show.
Les, great to have you too.
Hi, Les.
So, Mr. Alter, in your book, you delve into the background of Jimmy Carter. One of the things that was fascinating is that Jimmy Carter's mother was actually a supporter of Lyndon B. Johnson, and she was also the target of political violence. Her car was often targeted by those who were antagonistic to the civil rights movement and antagonistic to the war on poverty and to the Great Society programs of the LBJ era. Could you elaborate on that and also how it influenced Carter's politics?
So by that time, Carter was in the Georgia State Senate. And so I think Lillian Carter, they called her Ms. Lillian, her influence on him really came earlier than that, when he was a boy. And, Carter's father was a white supremacist, but Lillian was very unusual for her time. She was considered to be the only person in Sumter County who had anything nice to say about Abraham Lincoln. And from the time he was a little boy, he watched as she took care of African-American patients for free. So he got his compassion, his interest in health issues. Now, of course, he's been a major source for good in global health. And that comes from his mother's side of the family. But in 1964, which was the year of the Civil Rights Act, Lyndon Johnson was running. He ended up winning in a landslide, but he did not do well in the Deep South. And George Wallace was running as an independent, and almost everybody in the Carter's neck of the woods was for George Wallace. So the Carter family was quite unusual. Jimmy Carter himself had to keep kind of a low profile because if his constituents thought that he was too identified with LBJ, it could be a problem for him politically. But his mother was going to do what she was going to do. And actually, so were his kids. So Chip Carter told me, that's his second son, that he wore a Johnson button to school, and he got into a big fight. And, it was a gutsy thing to do, to be for Lyndon Johnson in Plains, Georgia in 1964.
And, oftentimes folks, Americans who lived through the Carter presidency might say that it was Jimmy Carter's mother who was his more significant influence on his life and his political ideology. But his father was also a political force. He also in his own right was elected to the Georgia State House of Representatives. Is that correct?
Yes, but he got sick with pancreatic cancer and died shortly after he was elected. And he died in 1953 when he was in his 50s, and all of Carter's siblings, all three of them, Gloria, Ruth, and Billy, they all also died of pancreatic cancer. So his father, I don't think, was as influential on him in politics as he was as a civic leader. So when his father died, Carter took on many of his civic responsibilities. He became eventually chair of the Sumter County School Board and a whole range of other things that Earl Carter had done. And he and his father had been estranged starting around the time he was at the Naval Academy, and they were not in touch sometimes for a considerable period of time. And it was mostly over race. And Jimmy Carter had defended the first Black midshipman at the Naval Academy. He defended Black crew members on board a submarine. And when he came home and told his father the story of how when they were invited to a fancy party in the Caribbean, and when he found out that the Black crew members were not going to be allowed to go to the party, were not invited, Carter organized an effort among all the other crew members to say, well, if these guys aren't going, we're not going either. And when he told his father that story, his father got very upset. He didn't understand why his son was doing this. And so they had their issues over race for a while. But then, by the time things got really rough, I think it was more Carter's political interests that caused him to keep a low profile. And as he told me at one point when I was pressing him on some of these things, he said, I never claimed to be a part of the civil rights movement. He had a choice to make. Did he want to be governor or did he want to be a civil rights activist? And he decided he wanted to be governor. And then he spent immediately, within literally seconds of taking the oath of office as the governor of Georgia in 1971, he began to integrate Georgia state government. And then when he became president, to diversify the U.S. government. And, he hung Martin Luther King's portrait in the state capitol, and he became the Jimmy Carter we know now. And so he was about 50 at that time. And my argument is that he spent the second half of his life making up for what he didn't do in the first half of his life, which was stand up for civil rights, even though he knew the right thing to do.
Now, Jimmy Carter ran for governor in 1966 and lost, and then planned the next 4 years plotting out how he was going to overcome that loss. Could you shed some light on who he's lost to and what he was going through during that time period? And also, why is it that he was appealing to some of these segregationist organizations and groups in Georgia, being that he was someone who resonated with folks who were in his past? I believe there was an African-American his mother who was always encouraging him to memorize scripture passages.
Yeah, so in 1966, it was a very bitter loss for him. He'd gotten in kind of late, and he was sort of a dark horse candidate for governor, but he seemed to be doing surprisingly well. And then he ended up losing to Lester Maddox, infamous segregationist. And I think after that loss, first he had a bit of a religious crisis of faith. He was a little depressed. He went on these missions in 1968 in the North, in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. He went door to door for Jesus. Very interesting part of his life that I chronicle in his very best. But at the same time, he was developing a very hard-nosed political strategy. And he basically said, look, I'm not going to lose the next time. And the second time he was running against a former governor named Carl Sanders, who was, by today's standards, he wasn't liberal, but by the standards of Georgia in the 1960s, he was liberal. He was a friend of JFK. And he was trying to make a comeback because you were term limited. You couldn't serve consecutive terms in those days in Georgia. So he was trying to make a comeback in 1970, and he had the Atlanta vote. He had more of the more liberal vote, or more the vote of those more enlightened on race. He had the black vote. And so in order to win, Carter had to get the rural vote. He had to get the folks in his part of the state to be behind him. So he used some code words. He talked about, George Wallace. He said nice things about Wallace. He even, after having rejected the White Citizens Council in Plains when they tried to get him to join, and he, as he told the story many times, he refused to join in his town because he knew it was a bad outfit. But in order to win that election, that primary in 1970, he paid a visit to the founder of the Georgia White Citizens Council just before the election, and that played very loudly in rural Georgia and worked well for him. But you have to remember that compared to somebody like Trump, this is nothing. This is absolutely nothing. He didn't ever try to stigmatize people or appeal to fear, appeal to racism. He just would send a little signal like I'm with you, but it was all unspoken. And then something very interesting happened on the last day of the campaign. He was flying around the state with his pilot, who was a Jewish guy, very eccentric guy who had been quite close to Martin Luther King and actually been in business with the King family and very tight with them. And he had taken Carter some black churches in the 1970 campaign. And he said to this pilot, whose name was David Rabhan, you've been so nice to me during this campaign. You've flown me around on your Piper Cub. What can I do for you? And so this guy takes out a flight manual and a pencil, and he writes on it, the time for racial discrimination is over. And he says to Carter, sign this and commit to me that you're going to say it when you're sworn in as governor in your inaugural address. And while that piece of paper doesn't survive, I talked to both Rabhan and Carter about it, and it's true. And Carter said it, and he ended up on the front page of the New York Times. It was it doesn't sound like anything today to say the time for racial discrimination is over, but at the time, for a new governor of Georgia, it was a big deal. And then he went on to be the Jimmy Carter that we know today. He evolved on this. And I think it's important to let politicians do this, not hold them accountable when they move to a better place, hold them accountable when they move to a worse place, and that's something I think for the press to keep in mind, because they're so interested in, Kamala Harris said this in 2019. Well, maybe she changed. And, as Winston Churchill said, when new facts come in, I change my opinion. What do you do when new facts come along? You should change your opinion, So anyway, I think, I think that he, in some ways, was atoning for the period where he was on the sidelines during the civil rights movement, and a lot of the intensity of his commitment, not just to African Americans and their struggle for rights, but to dispossessed people all over the world. It comes in part from his mother, in part from Rachel Clark, who was essentially a third parent, an illiterate Black woman farmhand who gave him much of his love of nature and his faith. The combination of his mother and her, and then this experience growing up and resisting the whole time. He and Rosalind, they were among the only liberals. They had to keep it quiet, for a lot of different reasons. His business would be boycotted if he was too, at one point it was boycotted, if he lifted his head too much on these issues. So he goes through all of that. And then when he comes out the other end, when he's governor, then he resolves he's going to do not just the right thing for the rest of his life, but really intensely advance these issues.
So, Les, you were working with the Carter campaign,
Can
and go ahead.
I was just going to add to what Jonathan has said, and understand that I didn't get to know Carter or become part of his operation until the summer of 1975. So that all of this history, although I will say, Jonathan, that I remember being struck by the news of his inaugural, even when I was living in California at the time. It made the news, and eventually was not for. But I remember reading about his inaugural address and what a stunning thing that was to have him say. I want to, reading your book and others and talking to folks who were involved in the 1966 Gary Rashun, who handled all of Carter's advertising. In addition to, let's say, being reticent on the race issue, I guess I'm being a little kind here, but he was a out and rural populist. That was the other thing he used against Carl Sanders. So they labeled Sanders as Carl, and they filmed commercials of Sanders, high-end donor meetings at private clubs and stuff like that. So there was not a certainly a rural populist appeal to Carter's successful campaign in 1970.
Yeah, good point.
And Les, you were involved with the Carter White House and the Carter campaign, like you alluded to just now. What are some of the lessons do you think he learned from the governor's races in 66 and 70 that he applied in 76 to distinguish himself among so many Democrats in that primary, like Frank Church, like Morris Udall? You had his future vice president, Walter Mondale, running. You had Jerry Brown, the governor of California. You had Lloyd Benston, who was going to later run in 1984 as the running mate of Walter Mondale. How did he distinguish himself from so many people? And I think that this was actually one of the first primaries, if I'm not mistaken, where the Iowa caucuses was the first in the nation contest. I think he's having Les is having some technical difficulties.
Yeah, I can try to answer that question for you a little bit. Just as a matter of record, Walter Mondale actually decided not to run that year. He said he didn't want to spend all of his time sleeping at Holiday Inns, was the way he put it. But many of those others did run. The Birch Bayh was considered to be the favorite. And Ted Kennedy decided not to run, which was a big deal that year. But basically the other candidates were senators. And Carter was a governor. He was an outsider. And they were still in the Senate. Carter didn't have a job. He had finished as governor. So he was able to campaign full time for all of 1975. And as you said, he recognized that the Iowa caucuses, which were pretty new and hadn't been a big deal, could be a way to catapult him into New Hampshire. So he ended up winning both the Iowa caucuses. Well, he finished second to, uncommitted, but he basically won the Iowa caucuses and then the New Hampshire primary. Then he lost some primaries, but he came back to secure the nomination, in part because he was the more moderate Democrat and the liberal Democrats kind of split the vote. We think of Jimmy Carter now as being very liberal, but he was actually a moderate candidate and a moderate president. And, he looked at issues individually. He wasn't interested in ideology. He wanted to know what worked or what did not work. And in that sense, his politics anticipated those of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. He was not a conventional liberal Democrat by any means. And in fact, Ted Kennedy challenged him in 1980 from the left because he thought Carter was not liberal enough. That was a huge mistake in retrospect.
Yeah. And so much talk has been, today, especially being that today is former President Carter's 100th birthday. So much talk is focused on his his work after his presidency, his post-presidency, but so much little attention goes towards some of the legislation that he passed. And I had you on the show before, Mr. Alder, and we talked about your book. And in the book, it just conveys how his the enormous amount of legislation that was passed was only dwarfed by the Johnson administration's, the last Democratic administration's legislative work with its Great Society. There are so many things, you know, I alluded to it at the beginning of the show, but what are some of the things that you wish young people or people in general really knew about the Carter administration and characterized his presidency as such?
Well, I think you got at some of it, and you know, Les really knows the subject best because that's the area he was working in. But and you cited a number of examples, but they basically had a bill signing almost every week. Now, they didn't get some big bills through on welfare reform and tax reform, but healthcare reform, but they hit a huge number of singles and doubles that often had huge impact. I mean, I remember one time I asked a good reporter from the Carter era if he'd ever heard of something called PURPA, PURPA. He said, no, what's that? I said, well, when you were covering the White House, Jimmy Carter signed the Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act, and this incentivized public utilities to use clean energy for the first time. You know, slight detail, like that's a big deal, right? And there were basically 15 major pieces of environmental legislation. You mentioned only a few of them. And then at the end of his time in office, he issued the first report on climate change. And if there had been a second Carter administration, he would have begun to address that issue in the early 1980s. In the report, the carbon emissions that they highlighted that we should get to were precisely what the Paris Climate Accords 35 years later came to. Imagine if we had moved to that kind of approach in the 1980s, how much better off we would be on climate. Now, Carter, you know, to be fair about it, he wasn't against fossil fuel. He was very strongly pro-coal because he wanted energy independence and wanted the Arab states to stop having us over a barrel, you know. And so, but he definitely, as people know, that he put the solar panels up on the roof of the White House. You know, he was very committed to alternative energy. And then I think, you know, you mentioned airline deregulation, but there was also trucking and rail deregulation. There's a former congressman, very conservative, named Phil Gramm, who wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal today about how great Carter's deregulatory agenda was, which he did in tandem with his arch rival, Ted Kennedy, who also understood the importance of economic deregulation that was not deregulating Wall Street, was not deregulating the EPA or the FDA the way Trump wants to do and the way Reagan did, but deregulating these kind of cartels that had been established. So trucking deregulation, I think, has been terribly underemphasized. You know, they used to have it, you'd go one way, the full load, and then these dumb regulations would require you to go back to where you started with an empty, you know, truck. And now this deregulation basically created the just-in-time delivery system that we have. And then if you look at something like normalization of relations with China, for all of our problems with China, that bilateral relationship is the foundation of the global economy. You know, we're going to see, you know, we're going to learn a lot more about this if Trump wins, because, you know, if you have a 60% tariff on all Chinese goods, not targeted, but all Chinese imports, people are going to find out that so much of what they have in their daily life will just be so much more expensive because of it'll make the inflation of the last years look like nothing if they do that. And this is because they're, you know, Carter got it right initially that we had to have an economic connection to China, and it was in all of our interest to do so.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, we have a power outage here in the foothills. I don't know if it's because of the heat or if I don't know what's happening. So it's uneven. It may go out again. I want to talk about what Jonathan just mentioned, but I want to go back to the questions that you asked before I dropped off, Michael, about Carter, did he learn lessons from the gubernatorial campaigns that he applied in the 76 successful presidential campaign? I'm not sure that I can draw a straight line to that, but you have to remember 1976, and Jonathan about this. Carter,
Man, I was looking forward to hearing what he had to say, but
yeah. When you call him back, Mike, I'm sure you're going to edit this a lot and stuff. He was really right there. I mean, you can do, an independent interview with Les, and you'll get a lot of good stuff. If we can't get him back.
Yeah, and Mr. Alter, I think one of the things that broke in recent years was the news that you had, a 1980s October surprise, so to speak, when you had Peter Baker reporting in the New York Times that former Texas Governor John Connally, who sought the Republican presidential nomination in 1980, who was in the car with President Kennedy in November 23rd, 1963, there was, talk that he told the Arab officials whom he spoke to relay a message to Iran to the effect that Ronald Reagan is going to be elected president in 1980, and you need to get the word to Iran that they're going to make a better deal with Reagan than they are with Carter. And so this, of course, has opened up, just a bombshell of opinions, of critiques from the left, from those who are saying, well, this violates so much, federal law. This is un-American, it's unpatriotic, it's undermining the State Department, it's undermining the sitting commander-in-chief, and it's playing politics ultimately with Americans' lives. What are your take as someone who is a historian and someone who's well-versed in terms of the Carter administration? Do you think that they have a point there where, had this not happened, Carter probably could have been reelected?
Well, first of all, I co-wrote with some other Carter historians an article about what it all meant in the New Republic after the New York Times article came out. The truth is that was interesting, but it wasn't actually central to the whole thing, because like Anwar Sadat, one of the Arab leaders to supposedly deliver a message, he was very, very close to Jimmy Carter. So if John Connally told him deliver a message to the Ayatollah against Jimmy Carter, Anwar Sadat is sitting there going, no way. So, but there was, in all likelihood, and we don't have final proof, there was what is called an October surprise. And it revolved around the guy who sent John Connally and the former lieutenant governor of Texas to, his name was Ben Barnes, on that mission. And that was William Casey, who was Ronald Reagan's campaign manager and later his director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And the conspiracy that is in all likelihood took place is not about John Connally. It's about William Casey. So anybody who wants to research this needs to focus on Casey. And the allegation was that Casey was attending a conference in London in the summer of 1980, and that he slipped out of the conference and went to Madrid, Spain, and met with representatives of the Ayatollah and urged them to, as they later alleged, to not release the hostages until Reagan became president and they would get a better deal. Now, there was a period when Congress was investigating this, and there were a lot of efforts to debunk this, what was considered to be a conspiracy theory about Casey going to Madrid for this meeting. And a lot of people, including the magazine I used to work for, Newsweek, they thought they had debunked it. Oh, Casey, they never saw him in Madrid. It never happened. So-and-so saw him in London. He signed into this conference. And there were no hotel records in Madrid. Well, it turns out that about 10 years ago, a now deceased reporter named Bob Perry came up with a cable from the U.S. ambassador in Spain back to the State Department that said, Bill Casey in town this week, not sure why he's here. And that the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush's administration, when this was all being investigated, they covered up this cable, which is as close as we're likely to get to a smoking gun. That Casey was in Madrid. He and CIA people almost certainly destroyed the hotel records because they haven't turned up. There's a guy named Gary Sick who was in the Carter White House on Iran policy, and Gary Sick, Kai Bird, and Stuart Eisenstadt, who had been a major advisor to Jimmy Carter. We wrote this article in the New Republic within the last couple of years that explains how this all quite possibly happened. And there's quite a bit of other evidence. I mean, I try not to go down a rabbit hole in my book about this because it can get, very kind of sketchy. And there were certain allegations, for instance, that George H.W. Bush himself, who was the Republican candidate for vice president, if you go online, you'll read, he went to Paris for a secret meeting in the middle of the campaign with the Iranians. A lot of, that's a bullshit conspiracy theory. Like, you can't just leave, like, J.D. Vance or Tim Walz, can't just leave town for a few days and nobody's going to find out about it, right? And so that was an example of a dumb conspiracy theory. But it's really hard to shut these things down. And just because some conspiracy theories are bad doesn't mean that, this really quite disturbing sequence of events did not take place. There's a lot of evidence that it did.
Yeah, and you wrote another book, actually, American Reckoning, Inside Trump's Trial, and
coming out in a couple of weeks.
Excellent book, and I'm looking forward to it. But and you paint a nuanced picture of Jimmy Carter in his very best, in his time. But Jimmy Carter, of course, is revered for his moral clarity. He told the American people he'll never tell them a lie. His lifelong commitment to public service. Whereas in American Reckoning, it looks like you're going to delve into the moral decay of the Trump era. What parallels can we draw between Carter's vision of honesty, accountable leadership, and the stark contrast we see in the trials and tribulations of Trump? And I say that in light of the fact that if you were to go into a scientific lab and just find or create the complete opposite of Jimmy Carter, I just feel like Donald Trump will come out the other end of that.
We are thinking along the same lines, and thank you for mentioning American Reckoning. I'm urging people to pre-order it, and then send it to somebody who's maybe, your Uncle Bob, who's maybe not MAGA, but he's thinking about whether he wants to vote for Harris. And it's, if you read this book, it's just, you just can't vote for this guy. It's so beyond awful. So if you're interested in the specific thing you asked about, I wrote an article in the New York Times that came out yesterday called "Jimmy Carter is the Un-Trump." And I went through a long list of things, but Trump is corrupt, he's chaotic, and he's cruel. And Carter is honest, disciplined, and decent. Donald Trump speaks to the worst in us. Jimmy Carter speaks to the best in us. Donald Trump, was cited and sanctioned for sexual assault. Jimmy Carter just lusted in his heart. Donald Trump wouldn't release his taxes. Jimmy Carter originated the idea of releasing your taxes. Both of them, arguably, you could make a facile comparison that they both like to talk to dictators. Trump talked to dictators because he's a wannabe dictator who's looking for their playbook, and he openly admires dictators. Carter was talking to dictators to free political prisoners, to stop wars, and to, in some cases, the case in Nicaragua and Haiti, to actually encourage them to do what Trump would not do, namely peacefully transfer power. So he got Raul Cedras in Haiti and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. When they lost, he convinced them to leave, which is what you need to have peace and democracy in the world, the peaceful transfer of power. So, I mean, we could talk all day about how Carter is just the absolute opposite of Trump. And I have to say that working on a book about Carter for me was a vacation from Trump. So the day that he came down the escalator at Trump Tower, and I was in the Carter Presidential Library in Atlanta, and MSNBC wanted me to go on and analyze it. So I went over and did. I was half wrong. I said, he's a demagogue. This is terrible. At the same time, he's not going to win. I was completely wrong about that. But what I mostly remember is going back to the library and feeling that turning those pages of the documents, it brushed away the Trump toxins. And at least for a few years, Trump couldn't live rent-free in my brain because, Jimmy Carter already occupied the premises. I was thinking good thoughts about Carter. He had plenty of flaws. He's not humble. No politician is humble. He's not a saint. We could talk about his shortcomings, but he's a figure of great decency, and he's a moral exemplar. And the contrast is very stark. Jimmy Carter believes that Kamala Harris is carrying on much of his important work, and that's why he said that he wants to stay alive long enough to vote for her.
And of course, President Biden was the first senator at the time. He was a sitting senator of Delaware, and he was the first senator to give his endorsement to Carter in '76.
Yeah.
What do you think about how Carter feels about how the Democratic, establishment, folks like Adam Schiff, Obama didn't come out and issue a statement against the party infighting. Nancy Pelosi broke her silence on Morning Joe. Jason Crow expressed his reservations. Jamie Raskin expressed his reservations. Hollywood folks like George Clooney wrote op-ed columns saying that they don't feel like Biden could, last for or be effectively make the message for a second term. And President Carter, being that he's very much in tune with what's going on according to his grandson, I'm wondering, how do you think he felt about how they treated him, being that he was the last Democratic one-term president?
Well, so we don't know for sure because he sees very few visitors. But two things. One is, if you're interested in the details of what Pelosi and the others did, I have an account in my book, American Reckoning, and I can't tell you what's in it because there's new stuff. But if anybody wants to find out, they can get the book. But some very, very, very interesting things happen behind the scenes. Jimmy Carter said a couple of years ago that he didn't believe anybody over the age of 80 should be president of the United States. And so I think that even though he likes Joe Biden, he came to visit him in Plains with Jill. I would speculate that he was happy that they found another candidate. The point of political parties is to win, not to respect the tender feelings of a politician, even if he's president. And so this was a very important thing that the Democratic Party did. It was tough. It was a tough few weeks. If you've ever seen the book, The Black Swan, which is about unexpected events and how they change things, I call that part of American Reckoning, Black Swan Summer, because what happened in July was almost otherworldly. There's just so little precedent. There's no precedent for it in American politics. And, if Harris wins, Nancy Pelosi and the others who stepped up will be seen as having helped save democracy. I'm very proud of the articles that I wrote that said that it was time for Biden to go. And and they needed to find another candidate. It was tough. I admire Joe Biden. I think he's been a very, very good president in many respects, but we can see clearly now that it was the right decision for him to step aside, even though it was a difficult one for him to make.
And the last question, Mr. Alter, before I let you go, in light of the fact that the vice presidential debate is tonight, during the last debate, Donald Trump and many of his sympathizers and supporters on the right in MAGA world complained that it was a 3-on-1 spectacle, being that David Muir and Lindsey Davis fact-checked Trump only 3 times in real time. But now you have CBS not fact-checking at all. And I've had conversations with conservatives, and they argue that the role of the moderator is not to fact-check the candidate in real time. They go back to 2012 when Obama was debating against Romney, and the Republican Party lost its mind when Candy Crowley corrected Mitt Romney in real time and said, Governor Romney, it did not, Obama did, call the attack on Benghazi an act of terror and go out to the Rose Garden, and folks lost their mind on the right. Do you think that moderators should make sure that both candidates are operating in the realm of reality? And
Absolutely. That's what journalists are supposed to do. I think CBS made a terrible decision. When you're complaining about the refs, it means you lost. And this is just sour grapes. These people are a bunch of whiners. Really. I mean, come on. Yeah. Of course that David Muir, what they said wasn't true. Everybody knows the dogs and cats thing isn't true. He would have been failing in his job if he had not corrected the record. They're not there to let people lie. Now, if you correct everything, because Trump lies so much that you could spend the whole debate correcting him. And, Kamala Harris said 1 or 2 things that weren't true. But actually, in her case, they actually were not, if you looked at it really closely, they were not lies. She misstated what unemployment was 40 years ago or something. She said it was the lowest unemployment in 40 years and it was really 30 years or something. That's not the kind of thing. But if you're sliming people based on lies, saying that Haitians are eating pets, and the mayor says that's not true, of course David Muir was right to correct it. And CBS is making a real journalistic mistake in not doing that. They're bowing to pressure. They're bowing to ratings or whatever. And frankly, I think it's kind of pathetic that CBS made that decision. Journalists are not supposed to be part of a popularity contest. It's not supposed to be even Steven. If one side's lying more than the other, the public should know that. It's truth, not phony balance that should be the standard of the way journalists conduct themselves. That's our interest is in truth. Yeah. And facts are stubborn things. And when people lie about them, it's arguably better for the debate if the opponent corrects them, but it's absolutely fine in a follow-up question for the moderator to do so as well.
Yeah. And in light of what, the fact that they're not going to fact check, what do you expect to see tonight from J.D. Vance and Governor Walz?
I guess I didn't realize we were live with all those things. I don't know why I thought this was on tape. So people are going to find out in the next, 10 minutes. But I think that my prediction is that Vance will throw. He's been lying his butt off for days, and I expect that to continue. And we'll see how Walz contends with it, since the moderators are not going to intervene.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan Alter. Thank you for dedicating your time. And I know you've been involved in so much today, being that this is the 100th birthday of President Carter. President Carter's officially sent, I think I misstated the phrase, but he's 100 years old. He's the first former president to reach 100 years old.
Centenarian. Yeah, you're right. He's the first presidential centenarian. Amazing.
So proud of him, and we're happy that he's making it to vote for Kamala Harris. Thank you so much, Mr. Alter. Forever grateful to you. And again, I'm so sorry about Les Francis, and hope to speak with him again soon. He had so much to bring to the table. He's another friend of the show, and we love to get his insight. So thank you, sir.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Great talking to you as always.
All right. That's going to conclude tonight's episode of The Political Mind. Thank you all for tuning in. Hi, it's Mike Taylor, the host of the Political Mike podcast. If you like what you heard tonight, I want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also want to ask you to please follow along on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Amazon Music. You can also follow along and keep up with the conversation through our Telegram channel. Follow us on Twitter at @ThePolyMike, and follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much, and no matter what part of the political spectrum that you fall on, I want to encourage you to stay engaged, stay a part of the conversation, and stay informed. Thank you.